In the quiet corridors of power where million-dollar decisions are made with the stroke of a pen, three unlikely allies are about to shake the very foundation of education in Prince George's County. A frustrated mother whose brilliant daughter was told she wasn't college material, a young county council member with a radical vision, and a retired educator who refuses to watch another generation slip through the cracks. Their secret meetings in coffee shops, late-night phone calls, and carefully orchestrated community gatherings are about to expose a truth that some would prefer to keep buried. That one of America's most diverse counties has been systematically denying its children the world-class education they deserve. But change never comes easy, especially when it threatens the status quo. As whispers of a revolutionary new school spread through the county, powerful forces align to protect their interests. The question isn't whether Prince George's County needs a top-tier educational institution. It's whether three determined individuals can overcome decades of political maneuvering, budget battles, and entrenched opposition to make it happen. This is the untold story of how ordinary people with extraordinary determination set out to transform the future of an entire community, one student at a time. The palace walls are about to come down, and the whispers are about to become a roar that can be heard across the nation. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead as Maria Santos stared at her daughter's report card, the same knot forming in her stomach that had been there for months. Sophia, her 15-year-old daughter, had straight A's again, but Maria knew that wouldn't be enough. Not in Prince George's County, where even the brightest students seemed to hit invisible ceilings. "Mom, did you hear what Mrs. Henderson said today?" Sophia asked, dropping her backpack by the kitchen table. Her voice carried that particular tone teenagers use when they're trying to sound casual about something that's eating them alive. Maria looked up from the bills she'd been sorting. "What did she say, Mija?" "She said I should consider community college first, because universities like Georgetown and Duke don't really look at students from our school district." Sophia's eyes filled with tears she was trying hard to hold back. "She said I should be realistic about my options." The words hit Maria like a physical blow. Her daughter, who had been reading at a college level since 6th grade, who spent her weekends volunteering at the local hospital because she dreamed of becoming a doctor, was being told to lower her expectations simply because of where she lived. That night, after Sophia had gone to bed, Maria sat at her computer and began researching. What she found made her blood boil. Students just 30 miles away in Montgomery County were getting accepted to Ivy League schools at rates that dwarfed Prince George's County. The resources available to them, the advanced placement courses, the college counseling programs. It was like comparing a luxury car to a bicycle. But Maria Santos hadn't immigrated to America and worked 2 jobs while putting herself through nursing school to watch her daughter's dreams be crushed by a system that had given up before it even tried. She started making phone calls. 3 weeks later, Maria found herself sitting in a cramped coffee shop in College Park, across from a man she'd never met, but who had answered her email with unexpected enthusiasm. David Thompson was barely 30, with the earnest demeanor of someone who still believed government could work for the people. As the youngest member of the Prince George's County Council, he'd been making waves with his pointed questions about educational spending and achievement gaps. "I've been thinking about this problem for years," David said, stirring his coffee absently. "We have one of the most educated populations in the country living in Prince George's County. NASA scientists, doctors, federal employees with advanced degrees. Their kids are brilliant, but they're being failed by a system that's focused on meeting minimum standards instead of maximizing potential." Maria nodded, thinking of the parents she'd met at Sophia's school events. Engineers who commuted to jobs at the Pentagon, researchers who worked at the National Institutes of Health, professors from the University of Maryland, all watching their children's opportunities narrow with each passing year. "What if we created something different?" David continued, leaning forward. "Not just another magnet school or a charter program, but something that could compete with the best private schools in the region. A public institution that could prepare our kids for Harvard and MIT and Johns Hopkins." The idea seemed impossible, but Maria had learned that impossible things had a way of becoming inevitable when the right people decided to make them happen. Their third conspirator joined them 2 weeks later. Dr. Eleanor Washington was 73 years old and had spent 50 years in education, from teaching second grade in rural Virginia to serving as principal of some of the region's most successful schools. She retired 5 years earlier, disgusted by the bureaucracy and low expectations that seemed to permeate too many schools. "I didn't spend half a century in education to watch bright kids get told they're not good enough," Dr. Washington said, her voice carrying the authority of someone who'd seen every educational fad come and go. "This county has the resources and the population to support a world-class school. The question is whether we have the will." The three began meeting regularly, always in different locations, always careful not to attract attention. They knew that what they were planning would threaten established interests and comfortable arrangements. The existing school administration wouldn't welcome criticism, and the political establishment had grown comfortable with managing expectations rather than exceeding them. Dr. Washington brought decades of educational expertise and a network of contacts throughout the region. David brought political knowledge and the ability to navigate county bureaucracy. Maria brought something equally important: the perspective of a parent who refused to accept that her child's zip code should determine her future. They spent months researching successful models from around the country. They studied the specialized STEM schools that were producing Nobel Prize winners, the international baccalaureate programs that were preparing students for global universities, the arts academies that were launching careers in creative industries. But they also studied the failures, the well-intentioned programs that had been watered down by committee, the innovative schools that had been starved of resources, the reform efforts that had been undermined by politics. "We need to think bigger," Dr. Washington said during one of their evening meetings. "Not just better programs within the existing system, but a completely different approach. A school that operates more like a university, where students can pursue their passions while meeting the highest academic standards." David had been taking notes on his laptop, but he stopped typing. "You're talking about something that would cost millions to establish and operate. The county council barely approves funding for basic maintenance." "Then we don't start with the county council," Maria said quietly. "We start with the community. We show them what their kids could achieve if someone believed in them." The plan that emerged from their conversations was audacious in its scope. They would create a coalition of parents, students, educators, and community leaders who shared their vision. They would document the current failures of the system, not to tear it down, but to show what was possible when expectations were raised instead of lowered. But they also knew they would need proof of concept, something tangible that would demonstrate the hunger for excellence that existed in their community. Dr. Washington suggested starting with Saturday enrichment programs. "We find the kids who are being told they're not college material, and we show them what they're capable of. We bring in guest speakers from top universities, offer advanced courses that aren't available in their schools, create opportunities for original research." The first Saturday session took place in the basement of a community center in Bowie. 23 students showed up, most of them brought by parents who had heard about the program through word of mouth. Dr. Washington had recruited volunteer instructors, a retired chemistry professor from the University of Maryland, a NASA engineer who lived in the county, a graduate student in biomedical research. The topic was the science of medicine, and the students were challenged to design experiments that could lead to new treatments for diseases they cared about. No multiple choice tests, no standardized curriculum, just pure intellectual curiosity unleashed. Maria watched from the back of the room as Sophia collaborated with other students on a project investigating antibiotic resistance. These are the same kids who were being told to be realistic about their futures, and here they were discussing graduate-level concepts with the enthusiasm of natural scientists. This is what they're capable of when someone expects greatness instead of mediocrity, Dr. Washington whispered to her. Word of the Saturday program spread quickly. By the fourth week, they had 50 students and a waiting list. Parents were driving from across the county, bringing children who had been languishing in unchallenging classes, kids who had been labeled as not college material by guidance counselors who seemed to have forgotten what college material actually looked like. The program attracted attention from unexpected quarters. A reporter from the Washington Post heard about it and wrote a feature story that went viral. Suddenly, educators from around the region were calling to ask how they could replicate the model. But the attention also brought scrutiny from those who preferred the status quo. Some school board members questioned whether the program was implicitly criticizing the existing schools. A few administrators suggested that parents who weren't satisfied with their current options should consider private schools. "They're missing the point," David said during one of their planning meetings. "This isn't about criticism. This is about showing what's possible when we raise the bar instead of lowering it." The Saturday program had proven something crucial. There was enormous untapped potential in Prince George's County, and there were families desperate for educational excellence. The question was whether they could translate that proof of concept into something permanent and transformative. As winter turned to spring, their small coalition began to grow. Teachers who were frustrated with teaching to the test joined their cause. Business leaders who needed highly skilled workers saw the potential. University professors who lived in the county but sent their children to private schools began to pay attention. The whispers were getting louder, and the palace, the comfortable arrangement that kept expectations low and accountability minimal, was starting to take notice. Maria knew they were approaching a critical moment. They had proven demand existed, demonstrated that students would rise to high expectations, and built a coalition of supporters. But turning a grassroots movement into institutional change would require navigating political realities that could crush even the best intentions. Late one evening, as she reviewed college acceptance statistics that showed Prince George's County students being rejected from universities that routinely accepted students from neighboring districts, Maria made a decision that would change everything. She would run for the school board. It was a move that would transform their quiet coalition into a public campaign, their whispered conversations into a battle for the future of education in one of America's most diverse counties. The real fight was just beginning. The announcement of Maria's school board candidacy sent ripples through Prince George's County that no one had anticipated. What had started as quiet Saturday morning enrichment sessions was now front-page news in local newspapers, and the comfortable political arrangements that had governed education policy for decades were suddenly under scrutiny. "Are you sure you know what you're getting into?" asked Jennifer Martinez, a veteran school board member who had called Maria for an unexpected coffee meeting. They sat in a bustling restaurant in Largo, the kind of place where county employees often gathered to discuss business away from official meeting rooms. Jennifer had served on the board for 12 years, and her weathered expression suggested she'd seen plenty of idealistic newcomers come and go. "This isn't like running your Saturday program," she continued, stirring her coffee absently. "There are union contracts to consider, federal regulations, budget constraints that would make your head spin. You can't just wish away 40 years of institutional reality." But Maria had spent the past 6 months learning exactly what those institutional realities meant for students like her daughter. She discovered that Prince George's County spent less per pupil on advanced academic programs than neighboring districts spent on basic operations. She learned that many schools didn't offer calculus or advanced placement courses because they claimed there wasn't enough demand, ignoring the fact that demand couldn't exist when students weren't prepared for advanced coursework in the first place. "With respect, Mrs. Martinez," Maria replied, "the current institutional reality is that our brightest students are being systematically underserved. If that's not worth changing, then what is?" The conversation ended cordially but tensely, and Maria left knowing she'd crossed a line. The existing board members weren't necessarily malicious, but they'd become comfortable with managing decline rather than pursuing excellence. Her candidacy represented a direct challenge to that comfort. The political establishment's response was swift and predictable. Within days, Maria received calls from 3 different political consultants offering to help with her campaign, for substantial fees, of course. When she declined, They warned her about the dangers of running as an outsider without proper political backing. But Maria wasn't alone. The network she, David, and Dr. Washington had built over the past year was mobilizing in ways that surprised even them. Parents who had never been involved in politics were volunteering to make phone calls. High school students who had participated in the Saturday programs were organizing voter registration drives among their classmates who had turned 18. The most unexpected support came from an unlikely source. Teachers within the existing system who had grown frustrated with the constraints placed on their ability to challenge students. Sarah Kim, a chemistry teacher at one of the county's largest high schools, reached out to Maria through a mutual friend. I have kids in my classes who could be studying organic chemistry, but I'm required to spend half the semester reviewing basic algebra because that's what the pacing guides mandate, Sarah explained during a clandestine meeting in her empty classroom after school hours. I became a teacher to inspire the next generation of scientists, not to babysit teenagers through watered-down curriculum. Sarah's story was echoed by dozens of other educators who quietly supported Maria's vision, but couldn't speak publicly without risking their jobs. They formed an informal network, sharing resources and strategies for maximizing student achievement within the constraints of the existing system while advocating for fundamental changes. The opposition strategy became clear during Maria's first official candidate forum. The incumbent she was challenging, Robert Hayes, had held his seat for 16 years and had the support of the teachers' union, the Administrators Association, and most of the established political organizations in the county. His message was carefully crafted. Maria Santos might mean well, but education was complicated, and dramatic changes could destabilize the progress that had been made over the past decade. He pointed to gradually improving test scores and cited the district's recent recognition for closing achievement gaps. Maria's response caught many in the audience off guard. Instead of defending her qualifications or attacking her opponent, she talked about specific students. Last month, a junior at Parkdale High School named Marcus Washington, no relation to Dr. Washington, though she's become his mentor, was accepted to Stanford University's summer research program in astrophysics. Marcus had to teach himself calculus using online resources because his school doesn't offer the course. He commutes 2 hours each way to attend our Saturday enrichment program because it's the only place in this county where someone believes he's capable of understanding quantum mechanics. She paused, looking directly at Mr. Hayes. Marcus shouldn't be an exception. He should be representative of what our students can achieve when we expect greatness instead of managing mediocrity. The forum's atmosphere shifted noticeably. Parents in the audience began asking pointed questions about why their children's schools lacked resources that were standard in neighboring districts. Students who attended shared stories about guidance counselors who steered them away from challenging courses, teachers who seemed surprised when they expressed interest in competitive universities. But the establishment fought back with tools that Maria hadn't fully anticipated. Suddenly, the Saturday enrichment program faced scrutiny from county officials about insurance requirements and facility use permits. Questions were raised about whether Dr. Washington's volunteer teaching violated retirement pension regulations. Anonymous flyers appeared in neighborhoods suggesting that Maria's elite educational vision would leave behind students who weren't academically gifted. The attacks stung, but they also revealed something important about the opposition strategy. They weren't arguing that the current system was working well. They were arguing that attempting to improve it was too risky, too expensive, too likely to fail. Dr. Washington, who had remained largely behind the scenes during the early stages of the campaign, decided to go public with her support. At 73, she had nothing left to lose professionally, and watching the establishment try to discredit their work had awakened something fierce in her. I've spent 50 years in education, she announced at a packed community meeting in Upper Marlboro. I've seen every excuse imaginable for why we can't expect more from our students and our schools. But I've also seen what happens when adults decide to believe in children's potential instead of making excuses for their failure. She gestured toward Marcus Washington, who was sitting in the front row. This young man was told 2 years ago that he should focus on practical career goals because students from his background don't become astrophysicists. But he's been accepted to one of the most competitive summer programs in the country because someone finally told him that his dreams weren't too big. His opportunities were too small. The applause was thunderous, but Dr. Washington wasn't finished. The people who benefit from low expectations, the contractors who profit from remedial programs, the consultants who get paid to explain why our children can't compete, the politicians who get elected by promising to manage decline instead of pursuing excellence. They're going to fight this every step of the way. But we're not fighting for them. We're fighting for Marcus and Sophia and thousands of other students who deserve better than the soft bigotry of lowered expectations. The comment about soft bigotry of lowered expectations, borrowed from President Bush's education speeches 2 decades earlier, struck a nerve throughout the county. It was picked up by bloggers and shared on social media, becoming a rallying cry for parents who had grown tired of being told their children's underachievement was inevitable given their circumstances. But it also triggered a fierce backlash from those who saw it as an attack on dedicated educators working within a flawed system. Union representatives accused Maria and her supporters of scapegoating teachers for problems caused by inadequate funding and poverty. The controversy reached its peak during a heated school board meeting in late April. The scheduled agenda included routine budget items and policy updates, but more than 300 people packed the auditorium to debate the future of education in Prince George's County. Speaker after speaker took the podium, and the divisions within the community became starkly apparent. Veteran teachers talked about the challenges of educating students who arrived at school dealing with trauma, poverty, and family instability. Parents shared stories of bright children who had been consistently underestimated by the system. Administrators defended their efforts to balance competing demands with limited resources. But the most powerful moment came when Marcus Washington asked to address the board. At 17, he was poised and articulate, but there was something in his voice that commanded attention from the increasingly restless crowd. "I want to thank Mr. Hayes for his service," he began, nodding toward the incumbent board member. "But I also want to ask him a question. If you had a son who wanted to study astrophysics, would you be satisfied with the opportunities available to him in Prince George's County schools?" The auditorium fell silent. Mr. Hayes shifted uncomfortably in his seat, clearly recognizing the trap the question represented. If he said yes, he would be defending a system that had failed to provide advanced mathematics courses to most of its schools. If he said no, he would be acknowledging that the system wasn't good enough for his own family. "That's not really a fair question," Mr. Hayes finally responded. "We have to serve all students, not just those with specific career interests." Marcus smiled politely. "With respect, sir, that's exactly my point. Why should having high academic aspirations be considered a specific interest rather than something we encourage in all students?" The exchange went viral within hours, shared thousands of times on social media, and featured in news coverage throughout the Washington metropolitan region. Suddenly, Prince George's County's education debate was drawing national attention from policy experts and education advocates. The momentum seemed to be shifting in Maria's favor, but she knew that her opponents were preparing a final offensive that could destroy everything they'd worked to build. Late-night conversations with David and Dr. Washington took on an increasingly strategic tone as they prepared for what they expected would be a brutal final month before the election. They had proven that demand existed for educational excellence, built a coalition that transcended traditional political boundaries, and articulated a vision that had captured the imagination of parents and students throughout the county. But they were also challenging deeply entrenched interests that had the resources and experience to destroy grassroots movements. The real test wouldn't be whether they could inspire people to dream bigger for their children's education. The test would be whether they could survive the inevitable attempt to crush those dreams before they became reality. As Maria reviewed polling data that showed her campaign gaining ground, she knew the most dangerous phase of their fight was just beginning. The establishment had been caught off guard by the intensity of community support for educational excellence, but they wouldn't make that mistake again. The whispers within the palace were about to become a war. The attack came on a Tuesday morning, delivered with the precision of a military operation that had been planned for weeks. Maria discovered it when her phone started buzzing at 6 in the morning with calls from reporters asking for her comment on the financial irregularities that had been reported to the county ethics board. The allegations were carefully crafted to cause maximum damage while remaining just vague enough to avoid obvious defamation claims. Anonymous sources claimed that Maria had used resources from her Saturday enrichment program for campaign purposes, that she had accepted illegal contributions from out-of-state education advocates, and that her volunteer coordinators had been improperly compensated using funds intended for student programs. None of the allegations were true, but Maria knew that truth was often irrelevant in political warfare. The stories would spread faster than corrections, and even if she could prove her innocence, the cloud of suspicion might be enough to destroy her campaign in its final weeks. She called David immediately, catching him as he was preparing for a county council meeting. "They're trying to destroy us," she said without preamble. "Have you seen the news?" David had been expecting something like this. "I'm looking at it now. It's professionally done. Whoever put this together knows exactly how to weaponize the ethics process." The timing wasn't accidental. With 3 weeks remaining before the election, the allegations would dominate news coverage during the period when many voters were finally beginning to pay attention to school board races. Even if Maria could disprove every charge, she would spend the final stretch of the campaign playing defense instead of sharing her vision for educational excellence. Dr. Washington's reaction surprised them both. When they met that evening in her living room, the 73-year-old educator was not dismayed, but energized by the attack. "They're scared," she said, pouring tea with steady hands despite the chaos swirling around their campaign. "You don't launch this kind of assault unless you're terrified of losing. They've thrown everything they have at us, which means they have nothing left." But Dr. Washington's confidence was tested when the ethics investigation expanded to include questions about her own involvement in the Saturday program. County officials suggested that her participation might violate restrictions on retired employees, and suddenly, the program that had served as proof of concept for their entire movement was under legal scrutiny. The investigation created a chilling effect throughout their coalition. Volunteer teachers began receiving phone calls from school administrators questioning their outside activities. Parents who had been vocal supporters found themselves subjected to unusual scrutiny from their employers, many of whom had contracts with the county government. Sarah Kim, the chemistry teacher who had become one of their most effective advocates, was called into her principal's office for a routine evaluation conference that focused heavily on her outside interests and their potential impact on her classroom responsibilities. "They're trying to intimidate everyone connected to us," David told Maria during a strategy session in his county council office. "The question is whether our people will hold firm or whether they'll decide the cost is too high." The answer came from an unexpected source. Marcus Washington, the 17-year-old student who had become the face of their movement, organized a response that no one had anticipated. Working with fellow students from across the county, Marcus coordinated a social media campaign that turned the establishment's attacks against them. Students began sharing their own stories of being underestimated by the system, using the hashtag #WeDeserveBetter. Videos of Saturday program participants discussing their academic achievements went viral, creating a powerful narrative about student potential that transcended the political attacks on their adult supporters. The students' campaign was sophisticated in ways that revealed how much they had learned from participating in programs that treated them as intellectuals rather than test takers. They fact-checked the allegations against Maria and her supporters, created detailed comparisons between Prince George's County and neighboring districts, and organized school-by-school surveys of course offerings that revealed stark disparities in educational opportunities. But the most powerful element of their response was personal testimonials from students who had been directly impacted by the Saturday enrichment program. These weren't political speeches, but honest reflections from teenagers who had discovered academic passions they never knew they had. Before I started attending the Saturday program, I thought I was good at math, said Jennifer Chun, a junior at Northwestern High School. But I didn't know that good at math could mean understanding concepts that most people don't encounter until graduate school. Nobody had ever told me that was possible. The student testimonials created a media narrative that the establishment couldn't counter without appearing to attack teenagers for having academic ambitions. Suddenly, the focus shifted from arcane questions about campaign finance to fundamental questions about what Prince George's County students deserve from their education system. The momentum generated by student activism gave Maria's adult supporters the courage to push back against the intimidation campaign. Sarah Kim held a press conference at her school, surrounded by colleagues who had decided that their professional risks were less important than their students' futures. I've been teaching for 15 years, Sarah announced to a crowd of reporters and community members. I've watched brilliant students told they weren't college material, seen potential scientists steered toward practical career paths, witnessed the systematic underestimation of children who could change the world if someone believed in them. I refuse to be silenced by people who profit from low expectations. The tide was turning, but Maria knew that the election would ultimately be decided by voter turnout rather than media coverage. Traditional school board elections in Prince George's County typically attracted less than 20% of eligible voters, most of them older homeowners who voted reliably in every election. But the controversy surrounding Maria's campaign had energized constituencies that normally ignored school board races. Young parents who had never voted in local elections were registering and getting organized. Recent graduates who had experienced the system's limitations firsthand were engaging in political activism for the first time in their lives. The establishment recognized the threat posed by expanded voter participation and launched a final offensive designed to suppress turnout among Maria's supporters. Robocalls went to households and neighborhoods with large populations of first-generation immigrants, warning about investigation into families connected to controversial education programs. Flyers appeared suggesting that voting in school board elections could trigger scrutiny from federal immigration authorities. The voter suppression tactics were crude but potentially effective, designed to intimidate exactly the communities that had been most enthusiastic about educational excellence initiatives. Maria knew that her campaign's success depended on turning potential supporters into actual voters, despite the efforts to discourage their participation. Election day began with encouraging signs. Polling places throughout the county reported higher than normal turnout, particularly in communities that had been most engaged with the Saturday Enrichment program. But Maria also knew that her opponents had superior organization and experience in turning out their traditional voters. The first results weren't encouraging. Early returns showed Maria trailing by nearly 10 percentage points, with most of the votes coming from precincts where the incumbent had strong historical support. David tried to remain optimistic, pointing out that their strongest communities typically reported later, but the initial numbers were sobering. As the evening progressed, the gap began to narrow. Precincts with large populations of young families and recent college graduates were reporting unusually high turnout, and Maria was winning those areas by overwhelming margins. The mathematical analysis suggested she might close the deficit, but it would depend on turnout in communities that had never before engaged heavily in school board politics. The race remained too close to call until nearly 11 o'clock, when the final precincts reported results that exceeded everyone's expectations. Maria had won by fewer than 3,000 votes out of nearly 40,000 cast, a narrow victory, but decisive enough to avoid any challenges. But the real surprise was the turnout numbers. More people had voted in this school board race than had participated in the previous three combined. Exit polling suggested that the increase was driven primarily by parents and students who had been motivated by debates over educational expectations and opportunities. Maria's victory speech was brief, but pointed. "This election wasn't about me," she told the crowd of supporters gathered at campaign headquarters. It was about whether we believe our children deserve world-class educational opportunities or whether we're satisfied with managing their potential instead of maximizing it. She gestured toward Marcus Washington and the other students who had become advocates for educational excellence. These young people didn't need politicians to tell them they were capable of greatness. They needed adults who were willing to create opportunities worthy of their talents. The celebration was muted by the recognition that winning an election was only the first step toward institutional change. Maria would be one vote among 9 on the school board, and the educational bureaucracy that had resisted innovation for decades wouldn't be transformed overnight. But something fundamental had shifted in Prince George's County. The Saturday Enrichment Program that had started with 23 students was now serving more than 300, with a waiting list that included families from neighboring counties. Teachers throughout the system were quietly experimenting with more challenging curricula, emboldened by evidence that their students could handle advanced material when given the opportunity. Most importantly, the conversation about education had changed from managing decline to pursuing excellence. Parents who had accepted that their children would receive inferior opportunities were demanding better. Students who had been told to lower their expectations were raising them instead. Dr. Washington, who had played the long game throughout the campaign, understood the historical significance of what had been accomplished. We've broken the psychological barrier that kept people from imagining what was possible, she told Maria during their first post-election meeting. The infrastructure changes will take years, but the mindset change has already happened. 6 months after taking office, Maria stood in the auditorium of a converted office building that would serve as the temporary home of Prince George's County's first specialized STEM academy. The facility wasn't impressive. Industrial carpeting, fluorescent lighting, and the faint smell of fresh paint. But it represented something revolutionary in a county that had grown comfortable with modest expectations. Marcus Washington was there, now a freshman at Stanford University, but home for spring break to help with the academy's recruitment efforts. Sophia Santos had been accepted to Georgetown University's pre-med program and would be starting classes in the fall. Sarah Kim had been hired as the academy's first chemistry teacher, finally free to challenge students at the level she knew they were capable of reaching. The Saturday Enrichment Program had evolved into something larger and more sustainable, with partnerships between the county schools and the University of Maryland that provided advanced coursework for students throughout the district. The model was being studied by education officials from around the country, and similar programs were being launched in districts across the region. But the most significant change was in the expectations that pervaded discussions about education throughout Prince George's County. The phrase college material had been banned from guidance counselor vocabularies, replaced by conversations about which universities best matched students' interests and ambitions. The whispers within the palace had become a roar that echoed beyond the county boundaries, inspiring similar movements in communities where parents and educators had grown tired of accepting less than their children deserved. As Maria looked out at the students and families gathered for the academy's inaugural orientation, she thought about how far they'd come from those secret meetings in coffee shops and community centers. The palace walls had come down, not through dramatic confrontation, but through the patient work of building something better, one student at a time. The revolution they had started wasn't complete. Institutional change measured in decades, not election cycles, but it was irreversible. A new generation of students was growing up believing that their dreams were not too big, but that their opportunities had been too small. That belief, once planted and nurtured, would transform not just Prince George's County, but any community courageous enough to choose excellence over excuses, potential over limitations, and hope over the comfortable management of decline. The whispers had become a legacy that would outlast any single election or individual leader. In the end, that was the only victory that really mattered.